Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, hello, peace to you all, and welcome to this live stream on the Adnan Husain Show channel. I'm Adnan Husain, and this program is Office Hours, our regular, if not weekly, we try to be weekly, Fridays, um, uh, a special program live stream. Usually I have a guest. And that's always extremely enjoyable and informative. But sometimes I also like to do a solo edition of Office Hours, which is usually how Office Hours happen in the university, where, professor, instructor holds open drop-in hours in their office where anybody can come, particularly students, come ask questions, discuss the readings and so forth. And of course, that's the idea behind this regular weekly program, is to have people drop in, talk about key issues taking place in the world, ask questions, make comments, and have a discussion. And so I welcome you all to this edition of Office Hours. It's the 18th edition. And I'm slowly recovering from various illnesses and so forth that have slowed me down a little bit, and also because of a great number of travels over the December period. We haven't had these as regularly, but last week we had David Yagubian talk about Iran under sanctions. I think it's a topic we might still want to be discussing, since that issue has not disappeared off of our consciousness and off the headlines. But we're back also this week for a solo edition, and we hope we'll keep it more regular now that we're doing it 2 weeks in a row. So it's great to be with you. I always love this is my favorite time in the week, is to have this after work. For most people, or many people who work 9 to 5 Monday through Friday, is as soon as you get off, maybe even on your commute home, start unwinding and thinking about the world and having a discussion with colleagues, friends, and comrades. So what I'd ask you, those of you who are already in on the live stream, is to like the live stream, so it gets on everybody's feeds who might be interested in it. If you haven't subscribed, you should subscribe to the channel. I think there's a lot on here that, if you're coming to these office hours, you would enjoy and benefit from. And if you can share the stream on social media, that would be really helpful too. Tell other people about it. So if you're watching on X, you can retweet it. If you're on YouTube, you can share the link on your social media platforms and invite others to come join this conversation. And particularly today, even though I have a full agenda of things to discuss, I'm very eager to hear your questions, your comments, and topics that you want to be discussing. For the next 90 minutes or so. We'll see how long I can go. If my voice, without the benefit of a rest and a guest, will hold up for the full 90 minutes. But we'll do what we can to have a full and complete discussion about so many issues that are happening, in the world. Also, I just do want to remind you, please, I mentioned at the end of the last struggle session, that I still want people to pay attention to various appeals to help people in Gaza. There's, of course, Lifeline for Gaza, but there are also collective mutual aid projects like the Samir Project, Palestinian mutual aid organization that seeks collective approaches to rebuilding the infrastructure and helping communities, particularly in northern Gaza, continue to stay on the land and to live, which is its own form of resistance. So if you can support those, I really would appreciate it. And of course, if you have a little bit of extra and you want to help me deal with some of the platform fees, and my ne'er-do-well producer and editor, Sina Rahmani, who's so busy these days because and isn't on the stream today because he's the impresario behind like 6 to 8. I don't know how many. I lose track how many shows he's producing for various people. All your favorites, I'm sure. You can do so by going to patreon.com/Adnan Husain, or one-time donations or contributions, buymeacoffee.com/Adnan Husain. Really appreciate it. Okay. All right. So, how to, one of the things I kind of made as a sort of headline topic, there are a lot of particular topics, hotspots around the world, continuing theaters of US imperial and Western imperial intervention and aggression and interference that, of course, we're going to talk about as many of those as we can. But one kind of framework that I think is worth thinking about, both internal to the United States and, of course, external. Let's be clear about that. But one kind of major topic is thinking about the end of liberal order, and what follows and what that process looks like, and what is our kind of materialist and historical left analysis of the end of the liberal order. Particularly, I'm reminded of it because my own prime minister here in Canada, Mark Carney, recently gave a speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, that essentially said, yes, the liberal rules-based order, was always kind of a fraud, but we were kind of quiet about that before. But now we need to be declaring quite openly that it is over, and that we need, a different world system. And so we're going to perhaps end up talking about that. It's not very often that Canada is headline global news. It happens when you have a drug using ne'er-do-well as the mayor of your chief and most populous city. I'm speaking, of course, a few years ago when Rob Ford was like, news across at least the West, certainly in the Anglophone media. And but when it happens, I think it's actually quite a significant touchstone, or a way of seeing what's happening in the larger world. So it's a microcosm that people don't pay much attention to, but when it becomes something worth paying attention to, I'm not saying in a strict sense. I mean, when the world decides, that it's needs to pay attention to something that's going on in Canada, I think it's reflective of a broader trend, or it's a harbinger of something that's going on that is worth discussing. So we may want to, I will certainly want to come to that and discuss it at some point in today's office hours. But first, I just want to acknowledge I'm seeing a lot of wonderful, regular, repeat offenders, as it were, in the chat. Alex and Pat and Haile Sela and Verena and Red Kitty and a bunch of other people who it's wonderful to see in the chat. I'm looking forward to your comments, your questions. There's a lot to discuss. So I'm going to need your help today to make sure that we can have a full and thorough discussion by reading your comments and talking about questions you may pose or topics you want to raise. But I first did, of course, want to talk about Iran, since we've had, last Friday, as I mentioned, office hours dedicated to it with, my friend and colleague, David Yagubian. And then it was, of course, a major topic of the most recent struggle session live stream on Sunday. I hope you've caught up with those if you weren't there for them live. Really outstanding and excellent analysis from these guests and experts and comrades. But there's a lot to talk about because at the time, we were reflecting upon the fact that the Islamic Republic of Iran and the government and the society had managed, it seemed, to weather an apparent regime change style operation, riots that were fostered and sponsored to try and bring down the government. And these were suppressed, by both government and social action, you could say. But that isn't the end of the story, of course. And there are some threads, even from what we're beginning to discover um, in greater detail, more and more evidence coming out, threads of how that happened that are worth paying attention to because they're part of the ongoing and continuing uh, U.S. and Israeli uh, pressure and threat of war in Iran, and of course, what appeared last week as perhaps another case of Trump always chickening out, as some people put it, Taco. Uh, when he congratulated himself on his threats preventing so-called executions of the protesters, because he made a big point about declaring that the U.S., or at least his administration, intended to intervene if protesters were killed and so forth, in a sort of bizarre sort of way, very much part of what we would call liberal humanitarian intervention. It's sort of more what you would expect from Samantha Power if she was in government under the Obama administration as Secretary of State, perhaps, or head of USAID, to be fulminating about liberal humanitarian and human rights based pretexts for imperial intervention and invasion. Instead, we get America first, being led by the, emperor in chief, who's supposed to have come in on, a platform of hostility to U.S. endless wars and regime change operations and so forth. But instead, he sounded like a liberal humanitarian interventionist himself. So, it seemed that he had pulled back from that, partly because Gulf and other regional states expressed grave concerns about unleashing a major war or bombardment or attack on Iran that would lead to countermeasures that would be devastating and destructive in the region. There was also even reports that suggested that uh, Israeli figures, military and political figures, were expressing caution about this particular moment. And I think what they were acknowledging is that the sponsored, armed riots, taking place once the internet was suppressed, or had been cut off, had not achieved the aims of weakening sufficiently the government and causing enough social disorder for it to be fruitful or useful to conduct an attack with the aim of uh, overturning the country. And so, given that context, it seemed that Trump and other powers and parties that were eager for an attack on Iran and an overthrow of the government were playing for time at the very least. And one of the other kind of material conditions in military affairs that we discussed with David on last week's office hours, David Yagubian, was, of course, also that there weren't enough military assets for the United States way of warfare, right? I mean, there are huge bases all over. the entire region, but the kind of air war and unwillingness to put troops in on the ground in kind of invasion means that the U.S. has to conduct its wars mostly through intelligence, disinformation, and air power. And there weren't sufficient resources really for a major attack. You could do something like what happened over the summer in the 12-day war. At the conclusion of the 12-day war, the kind of dramatic bombardment of already evacuated Iranian nuclear facilities, to be able to say, oh, we've destroyed Iran's nuclear capabilities and capacity, and have a face-saving gesture, to end that phase or round of the kind of war and the attack. We know, of course, those didn't accomplish their goals either, but there was a a kind of military political theater necessary in order to actually perhaps save Israel from suffering even greater consequences from the Iranian counterattack through its longer range missiles and so on. So, we know that there's a lot of kind of theater involved, and the style and approach of American shock and awe style of military warfare means that it's dramatic bombardments from the air, a lot of disinformation and follow up with confusing, trying to confuse people, paralyze the opposition. And this is all forms of psychological warfare in both the way in which the military conducts its operations, but also in managing the response and the after effects and the narratives surrounding it in order to be able to accomplish through these mechanisms what force alone or less amount of force, or greater amount of force would be required to achieve, right? So if you can get, the society itself to be stunned into paralysis, confuse its, command and control, which is a phrase they love in these, sort of, military speak, and all the commentariat and the news shows. You get these ex-generals and military figures, and they love to talk about things like, cutting off the command and control, and that this is, itself, devastating supposedly to the enemy society. And so they have these techniques. What that means, though, is that you have to put in a lot of these, aircraft carriers and so forth, and they weren't prepared for that at that time. And what we've seen is that subsequently, there's reason to believe, of course, that perhaps an attack is being prepared because two aircraft carrier groups have moved closer to the region. The USS Abraham Lincoln is now in the Indian Ocean, if not already in the Persian Gulf, in the Khalij, but also, I believe, the USS George H.W. Bush has been moving from the Atlantic closer to Europe and perhaps into the Mediterranean. So that would be perhaps for defense. I would surmise that would be for mounting air defense, and that's of course one of the other reasons why perhaps if those reports are true that Israeli officials were expressing caution about the timing of this, that this was, a U.S. attack last week would have been too soon. Part of it would have been because they have not been able to sufficiently rebuild and restock the air defenses that themselves, of course, proved not to be so impenetrable in that 12-day war. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this is still being planned. That this is a kind of long-term, multi-stage and multi-spectrum, war that's being planned. And the other component of it, of course, still has to be recognized, that touched off the opportunity because of protests inside Iran is, of course, the economic conditions that we discussed a lot about in our last office hours, Society Under Sanctions with David Yagubian. But more information has really come out, or more analysis. I mean, about the currency situation and the manipulation involved there. And I had already, by the time we had the last office hours, been reading and hearing of reports about the particular manipulation there when that occurred apparently through currency markets in Dubai. Um, when at the same time that Benjamin Netanyahu was visiting the United States, and that the very massive devaluation as a result of currency speculation that drove down the value of the rial, the Iranian currency, that touched off the bazaar merchants in the Grand Bazaar of Tehran to begin the first kind of protest, which was small scale on the first day, a few thousand perhaps merchants in the Grand Bazaar and other stores, shopkeepers and shop owners, and then it started to spread. Those economic protests, which, as we remarked last week, which were protected by the police, were certainly allowed. Many leaders in Iran, in the government, including the supreme leader, as well as the president, Pezeshkian, acknowledged the legitimacy of their concerns and complaints. The supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, in fact, even said a few days afterwards that he suspected that there was malign forces involved, that this was an unnatural kind of, wasn't just market fluctuations, it wasn't part of the regular decline in the value, which we can talk as well about, but that the sharp sudden depreciation of the currency had some kind of foreign interference. I think he may even have said in his remarks or his speech that it was a hidden hand. And of course, he didn't mean Adam Smith's hidden hand of the market. Another, that one we would definitely say is a bit of a figment, okay? A legend, the hidden hand of the market that was, regulating things, wisely, even if imperceptibly. He was speaking about actual attempts to dump the real in such a way that it would depreciate it very quickly. And I heard actually very interesting analysis from Alistair Crook, who sometimes appears on several different shows, but is a former UK diplomat, but based and involved in the Middle East. And I'm not sure exactly what he's doing now, running some kind of NGO perhaps that's about, kind of East-West cooperation of some kind. But in any case, as somebody who's been around the block and has good sources in the region, and also knows how British and US intelligence operations work, he suggested that, in fact, this was a kind of targeted attack on the Iranian currency, and that the government had perhaps not taken some of the precautions and mechanisms that can cushion this when this happens. And it's happened to others, of course. You recall George Soros, uh, um, of the Open Society Foundation, made his billions in currency markets, and was responsible for a great deal of manipulation of currency in order to profit, from it. So these things do happen, to currencies, but governments often try and put in place, according to him, certain kinds of currency swap agreements that can backstop the currency quickly when there's a clear kind of attack on the currency. And you have all of these things happening online through, these kind of online trading. This can happen, very quickly and very easily if you don't have mechanisms to stabilize the currency in place. So one hopes that Iran's government is doing what's necessary to stabilize it further. And I haven't been getting any good, clear, recent information exactly about whether it has stabilized, by how much, but I don't think it's having the same kind of dramatic sudden decrease that touched off the original economic protests in the Grand Bazaar of Tehran. Um, but I wanted to point out something, and I came across a really excellent, an interesting article on Press TV that corresponds with a conversation that I had when I was in Tehran with David, with a colleague who I won't name, but who's now Iran based and is a great, anti-imperialist legal scholar, and is in fact actually hosting and organizing, or was planning to. I don't know. I have to find out the status of it. Obviously, communications have been somewhat difficult with people who are in Iran, but had been planning a really excellent conference that some of your favorites, and guests on this show were going to be attending, you know, um, in Tehran, which was being hosted at the University of Tehran, or at least at an institute there in Tehran. But anyway, in this conversation, talking about conditions, this is before the protests, obviously, in Iran, and economic conditions. She was telling us about exactly what the subject of this article was, which was um, South Pars workers in the oil and gas sector. 5,000 workers who had organized and arranged a campaign over many months had gone on strike just like a week or 2 weeks before. I think maybe even just the week prior to the conversation that I was having. And the article, if you want to find it, is in Press TV. I'm trying to see exactly the date. Let's see, when is the date? Yeah, it was, I think, December 22nd, actually, was the date of the article. So just, the day I was leaving, in fact, Tehran, and 4 or 5 days before um, the actual start of the economic protests and the currency manipulation that took place the day before. And it was an article about the South Pars workers who were asking for a variety of, had organized several protests and actually gone on strike. And were asking for various things, improving worker conditions and the classification of workers and so forth. And she had been involved with some of the communications around it, and had expressed to us how difficult and how careful the organizers and the union had been to be able to define the clear demands that workers had for improvements in their conditions and pay and various kinds of benefits and administrative matters and so forth, while making sure that these would not be manipulable, by outside or external powers, to use and to piggyback on for sowing kind of chaotic, propaganda against the government, right? And that the point is that it's a national industry, but there's also neoliberalism to some extent also in Iran, where, and in fact, some would argue that these policies have not helped the situation under sanctions, but have actually helped exacerbate them, increase corruption, increase, wealth inequality, and so forth, as ways of exploiting these through private control over these resources and so forth. And that if they were socialized more, that there might be a stronger solidarity and resistance to some of the deadly consequences and effects of sanctions. So what they were arguing for in some ways was changes in government control, and control, and changes in the kind of contracting company that was doing that manages the oil industry, and asking for concessions and improvements. And what it demonstrates is that there is the possibility for social economic organizing, that protests are not only allowable but actually common and have been taking place, and that's in a key, absolutely vital industry for Iran, right? The biggest part of the economy is, of course, oil sales. And so one thing I wanted to mention that we hadn't talked about and discussed actually in last week's office hours is how much the specific sanctions, not only that have been in place, and the maximum pressure sanctions under the first Trump administration, and the revival of those, and in fact the increase in them, but specific policies just this last year that have been crucial in the depreciation of the real, and subsequently inflation in the cost of living in Iran. And that is some recent comments, in fact, actually help really establish this very clearly. Some recent comments by the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, who revealed recently in some interviews, particularly an interview during this Davos conference, the meeting of the World Economic Forum, that really discussed the goal of sanctions. And as far back, really, as February and March of last year. So beginning in that period, there was a particular designed plan to um, uh, uh, do two things. One is to apply sanctions and secondary sort of sanctions on um, uh, Iranian oil sales, right? And Scott Bessent said at the time that it was a goal to try and reduce Iranian oil flow to only 10% of its current, at that time, current, production, which is, of course, production that has already been under sanctions. So to completely starve the country of any of, you know, uh, the resources, that its most important saleable commodity that it produces, on the world market, to try and reduce those to just 10%. In other words, to cut it by 90% is an absolute kind of squeezing. And that's, in fact, actually the word that he uses, is to squeeze it down and to squeeze the economy into collapse. And the second thing that he said is that they expected and would work on depreciating the real. And in fact, he said, he gave the advice, if you're an Iranian, or if you're any investor, you should be trying to get your money out of Iran, out of the real, because the real itself was a target that they were planning on depreciating. So this is already in like March. And of course, what did we see? We saw that there was, since the summer, and particularly accelerating after the 12-day war, dramatic depreciation of the real. And that's ahead of the sudden depreciation and depression of the real, on the 27th, December 27th, 28th, when the protests happened. So we can, definitely say that this was planned. It was, a goal, and that sanctions were a tool. And that's so interesting. Actually, if you go do a search for interviews and statements made by Scott Bessent as Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, you don't see him talking about a lot of issues that you would expect, would be concerning to a Treasury official. Things about the economy, about the U.S. dollar, about, bonds, and so on, and what their plans are, and so forth, or maybe about how the tariffs, will affect the U.S. currency and any sorts of things that the Treasury will do to offset the consequences or effects, et cetera, et cetera. These are like, I mean, he does talk about tariffs, but he talks about them more in terms of policy of using them as part of sanctions. Okay. And what he does discuss a lot about is sanctions that he's applying on various entities. In fact, even just, I think, was it today or maybe yesterday, he specifically announced a number of new sanctions targeting specific ships that are part of what they're calling Iran's shadow fleet. So they fly under a different flag, but because they are involved with um, transporting Iranian oil, they're a shadow fleet of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And now they're being identified and sanctions are being applied on them. And if you do business with them or, if they come to your port for services, et cetera, then, sanctions will be applied. So this is the granular level of detail that the U.S. Sanctions regime, unilateral, illegal sanctions, are being applied. And this seems to be the big role of Scott Bessent, is to be the sanctioner in chief for the Trump administration. And so, this is very revealing, but also his own statements are quite revealing, where he said basically that the goal of these sanctions is to make life absolutely miserable, to destroy any kind of middle class, to immiserate the Iranian people so that they will have the discontent that we saw with the economic protests that can bring down the government, right? So this is, in fact, actually, as I said, and I hadn't seen these comments at the time. I hadn't quite made the most recent ones at Davos last week in office hours, but I said since the 1960s, if you read the literature on, U.S. government thinking about what the role of sanctions could be in pursuing geopolitical hegemony and U.S. imperial interests, they talk specifically about undermining radical, militant, nationalist third world regimes. This is the language that they use, these governments of, post-colonial societies that, intend to pursue their own sovereign path of development outside of the dictates of U.S. military alliances and economic programs. They need to be stopped and overturned. And one of the techniques that can be used are sanctions. And I would encourage people, if they have not listened to the Guerrilla History series on sanctions as war, go back and listen to that. If you go to guerrillahistory.libsyn.com or on any of your favorite podcast platforms, we did a whole series based on the book, an edited collection and volume by Emmanuel Ness, and I'm forgetting who else, who his co-editor was, but we interviewed almost all of the contributors. There are kind of chapters that are based on kind of the broader theory of what sanctions are and do. And then there were a number of case studies that actually looked in detail at the devastating consequences of illegal U.S. Sanctions. And I would remind people, and this is not something that I remembered to mention at the last office hours, is that or at least I don't think I mentioned it, that more recently than that series, that already was based on scholarship that documented from studies, UN reports, all kinds of other scientific analysis, had already detailed a lot of the incredibly horrific consequences for average people in these societies. That we now know that according to the Lancet's study that was published, I believe, in the fall of 2025, in September or October 2025, that millions of people have died as a consequence of U.S. and Western sanctions. And if you look at the scope of these sanctions, you see that such a vast part of the world, principally global South peoples, are suffering under um, what is essentially a form of economic warfare um, that is often characterized and portrayed, as we discussed in the Sanctions as War series and is discussed in the book, um, are often portrayed as a um, an appropriate, peaceful, non-military response by the international community, right? And that somehow this is better than war. And there's a lot of literature that suggests that especially when applied so viciously as the maximum pressure sanctions or the sanctions that we've seen that are incredibly strict and cruel on Cuba, um, that these, in fact, actually, when done over decades, have such a devastating consequence on the health and well-being and economy. I mean, you just have rises in infant mortality, um, you know, lots of deaths because medical treatments and drugs that are not possible to import as a result of the sanctions, that are life-saving, are denied. That this is why there are 30. I think there was a little blip there for a moment. Hopefully, everybody is back and the stream is continuing, but there looked like my software shorted out for a section, for a second or two, for a few seconds anyway. So, but we're back. Okay, so that's something that I wanted to mention about the Iran situation. But now, that by way of context, where Scott Bessent calls it economic statecraft. We might call it economic warfare or economic crimes against humanity. And certainly these are criminal sanctions. We have to be thinking now about, how we can prevent um, a war with Iran. I mean, there's been a war going on. As I said, there's been an economic war. There was, 12 days of strikes and attacks that also included the United States bombing Iran. At the end of the 12-day war, but subsequent to that time period, the Trump administration, Trump himself, has taken credit for coordinating and planning this with Israel. So we could say that the U.S. has been at war with Iran, not just since this summer, but for decades. But that now it has become increasingly a hot war, and we're on the cusp right now with more military buildup in the region, U.S. military facilities and carrier groups and so on, preparing what appears like a possible attack. What the question is what kind of attack, how extensive, and what will its consequences be? Um, I think these are the big sorts of questions. Arakshi, who is the current foreign minister, stated at Davos at the World Economic Forum. One wonders why they are bothering even going. I mean, there is, under the Pezeshkian administration, they are considered reformists, and they, have kept open the hope and possibility that negotiations might lead to some kind of resolution of hostile, of the hostile relations between the U.S. and Iran, and that if there's an agreement on the nuclear question, then perhaps there will be the possibility of lifting sanctions and so forth. And that's been the approach of the reformist wing, which is to be contrasted with President Raisi's approach. He is, of course, the previous president who died mysteriously in a helicopter accident on returning from meetings in Azerbaijan. I don't want to say he was assassinated, but there's mixed evidence about whether there might have been foul play or just a technical problem and accident. I mean, when you are dealing with using helicopters, US made helicopters, for which under sanctions, especially maximum pressure sanctions, you've not been able to get spare parts and proper, upgrades to service them. Uh, that there could very easily, just as for Iranian aircraft, that there have been real problems because their fleet has not been updated. They haven't been able to purchase new planes. They haven't, in many cases, been able to purchase like authorized, kind of parts. And it's been very difficult for Iranian aviation, right? So it's possible that it was an accident. I mean, why would we? Want to take that off the table, but I do think that it was incredibly inconvenient. Well, it was convenient for some and inconvenient for others. I mean, what it meant is that the policy, because they followed up with new elections and Pezeshkian came in, is that Raisi's policy was not to put a lot of faith in negotiations and diplomatic relations with the West, in the hopes that Iran might be accepted and that sanctions would be lifted, but rather that Iran had to prepare for continuation of sanctions and adapt and create new alliances, and particularly look to a pathway of development by allying with other Eastern powers in South-South relations, and of course, important relations with China and Russia. So this is, important to remember in this kind of context. So we already have a kind of reform-oriented administration that has held out the possibility and engaged in diplomatic negotiations, the day before the start of the 12-day war, right? They were planning for negotiations to resume on the Sunday, and the attacks on Friday night immediately after they concluded at the time. So what we're dealing with here is a real kind of end. This is why I said we really want to frame the discussion, the topic, about the end of the liberal order, because there aren't any international bodies or arrangements that have proven to be in good faith, right? But Araghchi's there at Davos. They still seem to be sending people to these forums, even though they are then being ignored, or people are refusing to attend their speeches, and so they have to suffer that kind of diplomatic sort of humiliation. But in any case, what he said at that in his address was that there would be massive response if there is any attack on Iran, and that they would not impose any of the limits that they had previously in this doctrine of strategic patience, which had really constrained and limited the way in which Iran made calculations of trying to maintain deterrence. Some people might have criticized this or said, and there were many in Iran who wanted a more aggressive and proactive foreign policy and military response. But in any case, even the reformists now, and currently in administration, in government, are saying that any attack on Iran now will change the whole strategic calculation, and that they have threatened that they would respond without limiting the kinds of weapons used. So that's one indication that they didn't use their full capabilities and arsenal in the 12-day war or in other contexts and confrontations, but also that there would be attacks and retaliation that would affect the global economy, alluding to things like, blockading the Straits of Hormuz, attacking energy infrastructure, U.S. bases in the region, and the hosts for those bases, meaning the Gulf monarchies in the region, which I think is one of the reasons why some of those Gulf monarchies, all perhaps except the UAE, expressly articulated concerns to the Trump administration when it was threatening attack in the last couple of weeks on Iran. So I don't think necessarily those kinds of attempts at persuasion were, very effective with the Trump administration. I'm not sure how much he cares about what the Qataris, think or have to say. But I think the real break on it at that point and at that time was both not having the military preparation and also perhaps some concerns among Israelis that there wasn't enough of an air defense umbrella, partly because it isn't just the Israeli air defense alone, it is the regional powers. We know from previous from history of the last two plus years that um, Iranian missile launches and drone strikes were intercepted by Jordan, by other Gulf government countries and governments that, of course, the U.S. had extended and put in place. All kinds of systems for missile defense that were being used to try and protect Israel from these strikes, plus, of course, whatever Israel has. So the fact that the U.S. carrier groups weren't in the region, in part, meant that there wasn't the maximum capabilities for trying to protect Israel from any potential counterattack from Iran, right? So you could understand why their calculation might be, look, this isn't the time to do it because we need your protection. You haven't put in place what's needed to try and prevent Iranian missiles from hitting their targets in Israel. So that's what we're watching now. And whether this will happen, it seems that something is going to happen. So all of our previous discussion about it has to be updated with what is taking place on the ground now. What I have as a kind of question that's worth thinking about is if a military attack is going to take place, the real question is what sort and what are the real political goals of it. And of course, looking at what's been happening, the major goal seems to have been for the 12-day war. It looked like it was changing the government, bringing down the Islamic Republic of Iran. But others have suggested that when you look at who some of the groups were that were involved in these riotous and violent, attacks, particularly those that broke out after Reza Pahlavi made his public statements encouraging Iranians to rise up forcefully, on January 7th, 8th, 9th, in that period where there was massive, coordinated across various parts of the country, groups roaming about, attacking ambulances, burning mosques, throwing Molotov cocktails and firebombing buses, other public transport and infrastructure, shooting, police and others. That period where there was a real upsurge that seemed kind of coordinated, that it seems to have involved a lot of small arms, machine guns that were brought in. Perhaps by groups like the MEK, Mujahideen Khalq, designated as a terrorist organization, groups associated with Baluchi, which is a regional ethnic grouping that is both in what is today the states of Pakistan and Iran, that have a separatist movement and a kind of ethno-nationalist kind of movement, as well as Kurdish groups coming in from northern Iraq, where they have autonomous and militias and autonomous, it's kind of semi-autonomous governed region of northern Iraq under Kurdish administration. And there are extensive Kurdish population in the northwestern part of Iran. That these seem to have been groups that were involved that are typically associated with like seeking at least autonomy, if not independence. And that suggests that perhaps one goal might be the breaking up of Iran, which is a regional superpower, is a country of more than 90 million, and clearly has not only the technological and military capacity to support resistance groups in Palestine against Zionist colonial occupation, militias in southern Lebanon that defend the sovereignty of the Lebanese state and continue resistance against attempts at, colonization and occupation of parts of southern Lebanon, which of course Israel did for 18 years before Hezbollah defeated them and freed the south in, I believe it was 2000, after 18 years. Since 1982 basically, and of course other groups in Iraq, and of course support for an alliance with Yemeni movements, Ansar Allah, and so on. So it is a major power that is seen by Israel as a challenge to the doctrine of Israelis, the Israeli doctrine of insisting upon supremacy and hegemony in the region, and that it cannot allow and accept rivals who could challenge its control and dominance in the region as a military and political and economic power. And so Iran might be a target for attempting to break it up into ethno-national components. That Iran is actually quite a diverse country. There are Turkmen tribal groups. There are, of course, Azeris and other kinds of groups in the north, in these mountainous northern regions that have historically been very difficult to govern. Like in my period as a medievalist, I mean, this is the source for a lot of movements that come down from the mountains and sometimes expand and control parts of what is today northern Iran, but are very difficult to subdue by any kind of central power that wants to govern the territory. So you've got those kinds of regions with their history. You've got Azeris, as I mentioned, a kind of tribal Turkic people. They speak a kind of Turkic language that Turks and Azeris can kind of communicate with one another to some extent. It's like a Romance language, Spanish and Italians, being able to kind of communicate their separate languages, but there's an affinity and a similarity. There are, of course, as I just mentioned, Kurds with groups that may harbor, among them, some may harbor nationalist ideas of autonomy or independence. I mentioned the Baluchis. There are, of course, also in the very crucial oil-producing region, particularly in the southwestern part, the areas where Saddam Hussein in Iraq, at the start of the Iran-Iraq War, began his invasion and attack, because there are Arab populations there that speak Arabic. That are very, kind of connected with the southern, Iraqi Arab Shi'is, right? It's basically the same people, and they speak a very similar dialect, but these are populations that are in the territory of the nation state of Iran. So again, this is a very diverse country. And it is always, you see that the colonial approach to governing and managing the region is very often to try and sponsor and patronize, ethno-national groupings that might have a difference in terms of language and identity that can be exploited to undermine a larger state and break it up into weaker components that are easier to control and to manipulate, or to divide and set against one another. And that's been a technique of colonial rule in the region for centuries. And we see that in fact actually might be the position that is most favored perhaps by the Israeli intelligentsia and geopolitical kind of aspirants for domination in the region. Whereas the United States, I mean, this is a question. So I saw one commentator, a colleague, and a friend, but with whom I find myself disagreeing on quite a few points in recent history, was arguing and suggesting that the recent events, where clearly U.S. sponsored and agreed upon and promoted decision between the Jolani government, well, also AKA Ahmed Ashara, but the Syrian current reigning ruler of Syria, um, um, coming to some kind of agreement and arrangement to integrate the Kurdish territories or areas that have been governed and controlled by Kurdish militias. In what they've been calling the Rojava state, right? Both of them U.S. Backed by the U.S., sponsored by the U.S., but of course there are some differences. Turkey is much closer sponsor and supporter of the Sunni jihadis governing Syria, whereas the United States, was supposed to be a real guardian and protector of these Kurdish militias who were guarding like the ISIS prisoners, right? And now those are, being freed, and God only knows what the consequences of that will be for, say, Lebanon or for Iraq. But the point that this colleague was making was, anybody who says that the goal is to break up, into these ethno-national enclaves, the larger states of the region, should be laughed off, the stage, because look at what's happening in Syria, as if that one point of one data point there falsifies a principle. But what I would argue is that there are some occasions where you do see, kind of rival approaches and some differences within the Zio-American kind of imperial order and elite. And that is that sometimes the U.S. is more willing or interested to support a kind of central brutal dictator who's in the pocket of the United States or dependent on U.S. support to pursue U.S. goals and interests in the region, whereas it may sometimes be an Israeli higher priority for the long term to ensure the possibility of like breakup of these states so that they're smaller and weaker, and that Israel's position and hegemony won't be challenged. And so it's not really falsifying, a kind of approach. It's just that there is more than one possible approach within this kind of imperial order that they may be pursuing. And that the third possibility that they're certainly seem to be committed to, and in speaking with authors of the Sanctions as War volume, particularly Emmanuel Ness, is that, chaos and destruction is itself also a goal, something that Ali Qadri would also really affirm. And we've had him on several programs, and most recently on Guerrilla History, talking about China. But in previous conversations, he has talked about how, spreading chaos, destruction, disorder itself is a goal, because there are ways to profit from that, and also because it prevents these societies from really being able to pursue an organized path of sovereign development that would challenge U.S. dictates and U.S. imperialism and capitalist accumulation in the region, right? So it seems to me that there are a variety of possibilities. I don't think, and my friend and colleague David Yagubian, who's written a book about nationalism in Iran, would argue that it's not really a foreseeable possibility, the breakup of Iran. And one point that he would make is that it has created a kind of nationalism, of Iranian nationalism, that doesn't have to be situated exclusively in a particular religious orientation, that is of Shiism. There are Sunnis in Iran, as I mentioned, some of these Turkmen tribal groups, some of these Baluchi groups, etc., are Sunnis, for example, or a particular ethnic identification, that you can have, Armenian Iranis, and you can have Kurdish Iranis, and you can have Turkic Iranis, and that there is a kind of capacious construction of Iranian state loyalty, you might say, loyalty to the idea of an integrated state that is pretty important and powerful, even if there are some countervailing orientations among some people within these ethnic groupings, like, among Kurds or Baluchis. Not all Kurds or all Baluchis would be supportive of a breakaway state. There are constituencies that are still connected with an idea of Iran as a state beyond just the kind of Persian ethno-linguistic kind of identity. And that's something that's been important to Iranian national statecraft. And what I would argue, just as somebody who looks at deep history and the longue durée of history, is to say that Iran, well, what today's Iran is, a successor state to a politically organized society that has a tradition of statecraft and state building that goes back thousands of years. I mean, the Iranian plateau, the highlands, has been the basis for a major state in the region of the, whatever you want to call it, Near East and parts of Central Asia, that kind of region. What Marshall Hodgson, a historian I absolutely love, called the Nile to the Oxus region, what become the Central Islamic lands, but that they have a historic kind of presence as a major cultural, political, economic power that had state institutions of a sort, right? Not in modern state institutions, but state structures, of an integrated military, ability to survey and collect taxes, and tradition of Persian kingship, the Shahs, right, all the way from emperors like Cyrus and Darius, to the of the Achaemenid era, who fought the Greeks, etc., who ruled vast empires, and also, during the immediately pre-Islamic period under the Sasanians, who were major rivals to the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantines, and in fact actually fought, major wars, over kind of the territories sort of in between, you might say, Egypt to Iraq, right, between these and southern Anatolia. So there is such a long history of statecraft, and of a state, of a polity, of political organization, that it's not easy to really, imagine that it would be simple to dismantle that. That it has obviously a kind of cultural power and legitimacy, on various different kind of bases, whether it was, one point to be made is that, in fact, actually, you could say that under Cyrus, Khusro, you really have the kind of one of the first sort of world empires that was built upon an idea of cultural pluralism, rather that you had kind of religious and cultural and ethnic and linguistic diversity that all managed to kind of coexist under the aegis of the great emperor, right? In fact, it redounded to the glory of the empire that there were so many different peoples that were part of the polity, and the approach that the governing the ruler, the emperor took was in some sense honoring that there were these diverse communities and peoples that all could contribute something, to the polity itself and the glory of the empire, right? So it wasn't an exclusivist or an ethnic dominant kind of notion or idea. There may have been hierarchies, but there was accommodation of forms of difference within it. That they didn't have to be suppressed in the way that you find under a kind of nationalist sort of idea or ideology in the modern era, or what I would argue in what you have as kind of confessional, what I call confessional empires. That is, empires that may have ruled many diverse people, but imposed either a kind of ethno-national exclusive hierarchy that perdured and excluded other groupings outside of the political and military elite and participation as political or religious classes, elites, or created a religious identity and an official orthodox confessional religion that becomes the religion of the empire, and means that that is the true kind of form or mode of inclusion, is that you have to be part of the dominant hegemonic religious community, and that sometimes what that meant is that it could turn heresy or religious dissent into not just a question of theological and religious difference, but also of political difference that had to be dealt with by the state, right? So when you have those kinds of structures and forms, you have oppression, persecution, suppression, exclusion. And I think the paradigmatic example of that is what I would call Latin Christendom's crusading society and Christendom. Okay, so but we could talk about that. That's a deep history. We don't have to go into immediately or right now, but perhaps on a different office hours we might discuss that as well. Okay, well, so that means that events that are taking place in Syria, I think those are quite important. The same colleague of mine that I was just saying, I really had a difference with using one data point to say that the U.S. is not interested in breaking up these countries because it's clearly put its support behind a more centralized authority under the Jolani, regime in Syria, right after the so-called revolution, the so-called Syrian so-called revolution, as I like to say. It wasn't really necessarily Syrian. A lot of the troops, participants, were from outside, and they were sponsored by, neighboring, parties as well as the U.S. and Israel. So, was it Syrian? It wasn't sort of a Syrian popular movement that led to this. And secondly, was it a revolution? No, of course it's not a revolution, because it doesn't mean, there's been some dramatic change in, there's been a change in its foreign policy orientation, because it's beholden to, the governing faction is beholden to those who supported it from outside, whether it's the Qataris and the Saudis and the Turks and the, U.S. and Israel, right? So, I mean, that's kind of, I think, an important point to recognize. It wasn't really any kind of revolution. It hasn't brought like some new socioeconomic kind of program for the society. So, but in any case, the question there, I said that, that wasn't really a good example necessarily that would falsify the idea that breaking up some of these countries isn't a goal, but it might be more precisely identified as a preference, you might say, of the Israeli faction and the Zio-American kind of elite. But also, that's also why I am not a big fan, you could say, of nationalism at all. As a socialist, why would I be? As somebody who's a kind of, as somebody who's a Muslim who identifies with a broader kind of system and community that transcends these national boundaries or ethno-linguistic differences. It's a much more kind of capacious kind of category. And, I think it has historically had a certain kind of political legitimacy. When you have this long history of the, say, Abbasid Empire, later the Ottoman Empire, the Abbasid Empire is often characterized as an Arab empire, even though that could very, much be disputed. And the Ottoman Empire is characterized as a Turkish empire. Again, not necessarily exactly accurate in the strict ethno-national sense, like, okay, they become Turks later. It's much like Eugen Weber's famous and classic study of peasants into Frenchmen. Okay, which said that basically it's a construction of the post-revolutionary period in the 19th century. Nobody thought of themselves as Frenchmen. They thought of themselves as, kind of in their locale as Bretons, as uh, uh, you know, people of Languedoc, or having these kind of local, regional identities, often seen as rather different. It's a lot like how Spain had lots of different parts and different kind of polities and kingdoms that it took a while to unify them. Well, Eugen Weber even said that was arguing that nationalism was really very much a 19th century construct, and that what had to happen is that you had to construct a sense of being a French person by changing the aspects of the culture, reforming the language and universalizing or making it more uniform, developing educational systems and structures to inculcate a common kind of real language and a common national identity through education, etc. In other words, he said it is a constructive project that has to be created. Well, you could say, I mean, if that is an argument to be made about France, how much the more is that an argument to be made about any of the nationalisms of like this region, of the Nile to the Oxus region? And a lot of people would have identified with other, kind of local, kind of civic, the being a member of a certain city or for the town you're from, maybe, the language that was your mother tongue to some extent, but also, of course, being bound in wider structures that were created out of forms of affiliation that were religious, like being part of a Sufi mystical order, like, that would be trans-regional and cross-cut many of the kind of political boundaries then and now that exist, but would be a meaningful sense of identity and affiliation that brought people across different ethno-linguistic and political boundaries together in some fashion. Or just more generally, the ways a lot of scholars have studied, for example, the way in which new forms of transportation and other political changes and factors that, including the patronage of the Hajj by the Ottoman sultans that would organize a major pilgrimage train to Mecca and Medina, starting from, Istanbul, that the Hajj itself became more popular and possible, not just for the rare elite or the scholar who was already traveling to pursue education, but for more everyday people, merchants, shopkeepers, etc., as a realistic objective to make the pilgrimage to perform the Hajj in Mecca and Medina. This helped create a kind of sense of the ummah, the community of faithful or believers, as a transnational, non-nationalistic, but transnational web of affiliation and imagination. So I would say that nationalism is a very recent, and it's taken for granted. It's a powerful ideology. It's a very recent one, however, that one could argue really is something that's a product of late 18th and 19th century societies, particularly starting in the West, and that it was globally exported as the only legitimate kind of form for justifying the nation state as the exclusive form of political organization in the modern world. And that it came later to many of the people who were denied being able to have their own, independence and nation state in the colonial era, than the anti-colonial colonial movements, of course, had to characterize and did characterize themselves as national liberation movements, but because that was, in some sense, the only language for political legitimacy, for autonomy and independence. And so I would say I'm in favor of national liberation. And if you have to have an ideology of nationalism as part of it, okay, but it should be a weak nationalism that emphasizes fundamentally the liberation component, is that you're fighting for sovereignty, autonomy, independence from foreign control and domination of a colonial power, which, let us remember, are not actually empires. They're often characterized as empires, but not in the same sense as the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Abbasid Empire, the Mongol Empire. These land-based older forms of political organization should be distinguished from the British so-called empire, because it wasn't really an empire in the same way at all. It was a nation state that was colonizing other territories around the world. And they used the language of empire and imperial as a like the ruler as an empire, but in fact, actually, there's a big difference between something like the Abbasid or Ottoman or Mongol or Russian or Austro-Hungarian Empire, this old world type, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, dynastic polities versus a nation state that might have had a monarch, but it was a nation state, and it defined political inclusion through a national form of identity that meant that colonial subjects could never be part of the political ruling class in any, or even its economic class in any meaningful sort of way, right? There's a division and a boundary. The point here is to say that the colonial era of control and domination rested and required an ideology of racism. All colonial regimes were racial regimes. And so that was an attempt to kind of secure a boundary of political inclusion and exclusion, which is very different from these older world things that we call empires, right? So we should kind of distinguish between those things. Okay, that's its own whole other tangent. I know a historical topic that would be really interesting, to discuss at some point. But what I wanted to say is that, you can see what the difference between kind of national liberation movements as anti-colonial movements versus the way in which nationalism as a political ideology is a real enemy to internationalism and to class struggle, right? To understanding class solidarity and class struggle as a key component. It's an attempt to say, oh, whether you're rich or poor, we're part of this national grouping, and those who are not part of it are our enemies, or should be excluded, or don't deserve the same political rights, or should have their own state somewhere else but don't belong with us in our state, and we can't understand citizenship except through this prism, so that political rights are distributed by this idea that tries to overrun class analysis and create internal and external inclusion and exclusion. And so that's why I have a real problem with nationalisms and national struggles that don't confront imperialism, US empire. Okay, those are the real problems, it seems to me. And so I can kind of distinguish between what I would say is, a legitimate struggle for political rights. But if your allies and your support comes from the US and Israel against the peoples of the region in an attempt to break apart or fragment or weaken these other sovereign entities, then it's serving the colonial program and plan. And then nationalism is a total danger, and is really the kind of thing that works for Zionism, is like, yeah, let's make everybody into this diverse region that was formed by cosmopolitan mixing over eons, now to try and pull it apart and to establish statelets on the basis of ethno-national identity. Well, that's what Israel is. And it can turn into a very oppressive, colonial, fragmenting of the unity of the region and preventing it from being able to contend with empire, with imperialism, with imperial capitalism. So that's, I think, what's important or significant about thinking about what's happening in Syria, and why it isn't really a falsification of the colonialist interest, whether it is in putting in a dictator that it can use to serve U.S. imperial interests, or fragmenting the society by emphasizing these ethno-national identities to the detriment of a kind of collective and integrated society and state. Okay, well, that's been quite a lot of me going on. There's so many other things that I wanted to talk about that may come up, and I haven't even been able, when I have a guest, I can go look more carefully at the chat and see what's going on, and try and highlight some comments and perhaps bring in some questions and pose them. It's difficult when, I'm discussing one of these topics to be able to do that. But one of the things I had wanted and hoped to talk about as well, that we might not have time to go into in any depth, but I did want to mention, is of course always a Palestine update. And what we see is in the Palestine solidarity movement that there was a long-term hunger strike by people who were incarcerated. They're political prisoners from Palestine Action once. Particularly after it became a subscribed group and designated as a terrorist group, which is just absolutely insane and unbelievable that these peaceful activists who are trying to disrupt Israeli weapons manufacturers and other industries that facilitate and are complicit in those were subject to imprisonment in addition to being fined and all these other things, but they were subject to really kind of brutal imprisonment. And they fought for their rights. They went on hunger strike. There was a kind of agreement that was reached, for some partial demands that the Palestine Action hunger strikers had, that led to most of the hunger strikers ending the strike at that point. But there are somebody, I believe his name is Omar Khalil, who resumed a strike and starting a thirst strike, won't drink water, and so forth. And we really need to be in solidarity with members of our movement who are trying to take action, in this case, direct action, to disrupt the Israeli war machine and its affiliates and its enablers, in kind of the banks and support services that are working to allow Elbit Systems, in this case, which they've targeted as an Israeli weapons manufacturer, from continuing to operate in the UK. And they deserve our respect and our support and solidarity. And we should make sure to be talking about them, to celebrate their heroic and courageous struggles. If we don't take care of people like this in our movement, then it means we really don't have a movement that is, planning on being, victorious and successful. We have to, uh, support and be in solidarity with those who are willing to put themselves on the very front lines, in solidarity with our brothers and sisters and comrades struggling in Palestine. It's the form of resistance that is possible here. And at least, even if we aren't people who are ready or capable or able to take that kind of direct action, the very least we can do, however, is be among those cadres that support and enable. For every direct action actionist who takes action, there needs to be 5, 10, 15, 20 people who are supporting in various ways, getting information out about them, being in solidarity, going to solidarity protests and support, doing these kinds of activities, fundraising for legal defense, etc. So there's so many things that we can do. We cannot abandon these people who have made a commitment to never abandon the Palestinians. I mean, if we want to be in solidarity with Palestine, it means we need to build a strong movement that is able to put political pressure, and among the most capable, uh, uh, you know, uh, orientation, movements or organizations that has done something material to help and assist the Palestinians has been those who have disrupted Elbit systems and Israeli military manufacturers and companies, forcing them to leave certain plants or to, move to elsewhere at great cost, etc. Plus the fact that it also generated such huge awareness, negative awareness for those companies that are doing business with Elbit Systems itself, with the idea that so much in our society and economy and political institutions are complicit in the genocide, to expose that and also to organize and inspire people, even if they're just going to go to protests weekly, they know that there is a group that is, sacrificing even more. That's inspiring to all of us and gives us energy to believe that we can, make a difference and see an end to this genocide, right? So definitely keep up with what's going on with them. Celebrate the fact that even while in prison, they continued to struggle. They went and continued the hunger strike for longer than many of the, I think, longer than the IRA prisoners who had a historic. And think of how much of an impact that had. What has changed in our society? How have we grown so callous, so impervious to the moral, kind of sacrifice that shames those in power and those in authority effectively? Like, that was huge news back when the IRA, was had its hunger strikers, Bobby Sands and other people. This has not been talked about nearly enough, and it shows how much has changed in our societies and our institutions. We are so much less democratic now than we were in the 70s or the 80s. I mean, this is really, really horrific. Okay, anyway, there's that. And then also I wanted to mention the Gaza Board of Peace has been, announcing its master plans. Jared Kushner, on behalf of the leader of the Board of Peace, Donald Trump, a position that apparently he's going to continue or will be able to continue even after he is no longer president, whether that's by impeachment, natural causes, or a future, defeat in an election. He would still be technically allowed to be the head of the Gaza Board of Peace. We are in the era of the viceroy. This is obviously just a mechanism for trying to soak funds that would be invested, or development funds or real estate schemes and projects, off the back of the suffering people of Gaza, who have been subjected to a horrific and brutal war crimes and a genocide. And now there are people like vultures who are organizing with the allowance of, with the permission and approbation of the UN Security Council, to institute a new colonial viceroy, to basically, return us to the worst parts of the 19th and early 20th century colonial era of exploitation, except now it's even, being sponsored and approved and legitimized within, the institutions that were meant to build a different world on a different basis of international relations and human rights. This is just so incredibly disgusting to see that these plans, and it shows that this is a model. This is that the Gaza, there's no post-Gaza world. We are in the Gaza world now, and it's a fight and a conflict. Are we on the side of resisting for the sake of humanity and human dignity, or are we going to allow, the extreme exploitation and deprivation and the use in of particular form of development, right? This sort of surveillance state with fortresses to wall off the garden from the jungle civilization, so called, from the barbarians, the surplus populations that are no longer needed in this kind of glorious tech future, protected by robots and total surveillance, total information. that's kind of, the dim and dismal dystopic potential future that we are fighting against, which is why the Gaza situation, the Gaza struggle, is a global world historical struggle. It is not just about what happens to the people of Gaza, as important and absolutely vital as that is. We are in complete solidarity with them for their struggle for freedom and liberation from settler colonial occupation and violence, but also because it portends that if it's possible there, it will be possible everywhere else. And we see the devastating consequences and effects of the world's silent acceptance at the level of leadership, not the level of peoples, but at the level of leadership and at the level of political and corporate elites and of states, that the willingness to allow the people of Gaza to be sacrificed as they have been is having devastating consequences on the rest of the world. We see this. Okay. So when I said, let's talk about the end of the liberal order, I had this in mind, that if you look at what's happening, is because of Gaza, you could have what's happened in Venezuela. Because of Gaza and what it has enabled and authorized, because of the impunity, is attacks on Iran, a potential war in Iran. It is starting to shake up, other corners of the world where Greenland has been under threat, right? And this is what has impelled Mark Carney to make his recent speech at Davos. And I want to come to that because I said we would talk about it at the beginning. I want to talk about this because I think, one, is extremely good politics domestically. So it's a smart move, whatever one wants to say. And of course, also internationally, because it puts Canada on the global stage as a kind of leader in, progressive sort of values, in calling out, the excesses of the current world order under the US empire and the Trump administration. Canadians absolutely love when they are in the news. I mentioned that they even seem to kind of like it, even if it's like, because they have a terrible drug fiend as a mayor, that as embarrassing as it was to many people, nonetheless, it gave a certain kind of pleasure that people were talking about Canada, and that somehow Canada was in the world's eye, for all the wrong reasons, but at least we were, being talked about rather than ignored as a middle power, right? Which is actually, I think, maybe more a minor power. Somehow we're in the G7. I don't know how, but we are in the G7. It just shows that the G7 may not be the most important collection of states that it once was thought to be. But now we're supposed to be a middle power, recognizing, of course, that we're not a superpower. We're not a great power, which is the language that Mark Carney used, recognizing that the world is changing. And this is a kind of liberal response to the problem of multipolarity and what the Gaza genocide has authorized in terms of aggressive return to the kind of 19th century colonial kind of era. Okay. And that's what he's refusing to really, kind of name it as, is that he's wanting to say that we're in this position of great power rivalry that we have to adjust to. And one way in which he's arguing for a different world order is some kind of strategic alliances to be made, flexibility on different issues with different groups of states, but as a tactic and technique for middle powers to kind of stabilize their world through some kind of form of cooperation. Now, this was really very interesting. Why is he doing this? He's been heralded, he's been celebrated in the Western intelligentsia and in the global elite circles for this courageous, apparently, I mean, it will, we'll see, it could have devastating consequences. Trump takes things very personally. I think it's a bad sign in some sense that the supreme leader in Iran, Ali Khamenei, mentioned Trump specifically and characterized him as a criminal. That normally you wouldn't do. Normally, when he refers to the US or the US administration, he has different, more euphemistic kind of ways of indirect kind of reference and so on. But to actually call out Trump and characterize him as a criminal is, it seems to me, a kind of bold move that, with the insecurities and fragile ego of the personality of Donald Trump is, probably courting danger that if he makes it, personal, bully as a bully to be called out in that way, then it makes it a kind of personal contest of wills, and that's actually quite dangerous. And I think Mark Carney, obviously, in confronting the problems of the consequences of, the reshaping world under U.S. hegemony, under an erratic and kind of aggressive U.S. administration, is, perhaps courting danger as well, but he's definitely being celebrated globally. So, how to kind of think about this? I think it's really kind of interesting. And I see in the chat that Carney's and Macron's perform. I was just gonna say, and I have in my notes here, is that you really have to look at a kind of comparison between Macron and Carney and sort of think of this together as two sides of a kind of a set of responses of the European and liberal Western order. So Benji, great. Let me just like highlight that. Okay. Oops. No, there it is. Okay. Some kind of US deep state op to rein Trump in. Like, this is really, very possible, as a kind of theory of, what might have led to this. I don't know if that kind of thing, will work, but I think the point is that you see these apparently stark contrasts. Okay. On the one hand, you have Macron, right? What did Macron say? He said in a text or some kind of message, he messaged Trump, and people were looking at this. He said, "My friend," uh, um, gosh, I got to look it up again. I don't know what happened to my tab. I had it. I had it all. Oh, it was in a Politico. I think it was in this Politico article. But there was too much recuperative analysis in this. So really what we want is just what he sent. But he said something like, "My friend, we are totally in line on Syria. We can do great things on Iran. I forget if he mentioned Venezuela. He maybe not, but he said, I do not understand what you're doing on Greenland." Right? I can set up a G7 meeting after Davos in Paris on Thursday afternoon. And I can invite, who's he going to invite to this? I can invite the Ukrainians. Okay, why? The Ukrainians, the Danish, the Syrians, and the Russians in the margins. Okay. I mean, this is fascinating stuff. Let us have dinner together in Paris on Thursday before you go back to the US. Okay. All right. So and Trump, like, let this tweet out or let this message out, like disclosed it. Interesting. Like there's a lot one could kind of speculate on or analyze and unravel. But I think the point here is that it's okay what you're planning, what you've been doing with Syria, destroying that, government and ripping apart that society and exposing, ethnic and religious groups to extreme, violence by this jihadi, takfiri, conclave, that has allowed Israel to occupy large parts of Syrian territory beyond what they already had done after the 1967 war in the Golan. That has, just led to, tens, maybe tens of thousands of people being displaced, thousands being killed and massacred in brutal ways, none of which gets any real attention compared to, exaggerated accounts of how many people may have been, killed or affected in the, riots in Iran, right? So it's okay. We're with you on Syria. What you're doing in Syria, causing devastation and chaos, that fits our agenda. It's okay, even if it's violating, you know, this sovereign country, because the U.S. has been occupying parts of Syria for a decade or so. We can do great things on Iran. What kind of great things? Does that mean like concluding a peace agreement on the nuclear, front, which is what Obama did, but then never actually lifted all of the sanctions that he was obliged to do under that agreement, and then, of course, which was absolutely torn up by Trump, and maximum pressure sanctions were imposed. What are these great things? You mean that you're going to collaborate in some kind of war and attack on Iran, and violate its sovereignty? But Greenland, I don't understand what you're doing. This is also what has led Carney to be sort of forced into acknowledging that the rules don't matter anymore, that the liberal rules-based order was a fiction, was a facade that he and others went along with. But he's saying now we can't tolerate. Why now? Why now? It's the same reason as Macron saying Greenland, that's a step too far. That violates, Denmark's colonial control and occupation over Greenland. What business does Denmark have over, controlling Greenland? Why can't this society of indigenous peoples, who are like related to other Arctic peoples of the North, have their own autonomy and sovereignty? Isn't colonialism supposed to finally, be over in the, modern world? Actually, now what we see is not only is colonial control allowed and authorized, but in fact, actually what we have is exactly like the 19th century carving up of Africa. Remember the Berlin Conference, where basically, these European colonial powers got together to figure out, how to resolve the competitions among them and to allow new, aggressive colonial powers like Germany and Italy a seat at the table, because they were much later to kind of integrate into a centralized nation state and construct a form of nationalism that could overcome, class differences, regional differences. People from, Sicily had almost nothing in common in their view with people in Milan in the north, right? And the people of the north looked down upon, the people of southern Italy, Sicily, those areas as inferior, they were backward, and all of that. But they had to construct, and they did eventually construct, and this is why both of these two European countries that can coalesce into a nation, centralized, integrated nation state kind of project later than say many of the other kind of countries like Britain, France, etc. This is part of the explanation, you could say, of fascism, is that, they had this kind of need for a much more kind of vigorous and aggressive social transformation to kind of catch up, as it were, with some of the social and political developments of the earlier colonizing nation states. And so the Berlin Conference was, one of these moments of carving up and trying to manage these different colonial states' rivalries and competition with one another. And you could say, in some sense, World War I came out of also these sorts of rivalries and alliances among, these European powers. But what's the problem here with this Greenland is it undermines a NATO alliance and NATO power, something that Trump has certainly already shown that he's kind of willing to do in some sense, is that to cast aside some aspects of that, or to kind of threaten the undermining NATO in order to, force NATO countries, NATO members to spend more on military, in military spending, so that it would be less of a U.S. Burden, or rather, so that the U.S. could sell more weapons to, NATO members, right? So, and Carney has fallen along with exactly that requirement. He has increased the budget for military spending, for so-called defense spending, rather astronomically, really historic levels, 3 to 5%, of the GDP, and that has meant real cuts to social programs and other things that are not going to be affordable under this new regime of increasing military spending, right? And so he's gone along with it up to this point, but now suddenly he wants to draw a line, and instead of using the Hitler analogy, which is probably the one, to think about, of like, is Greenland, was it about to be the Sudetenland, kind of Munich agreement or not? I mean, we see that it looks like there's going to be some kind of agreement or arrangement. We don't yet know if history will call it the appeasement or not, but it's something that's being managed to try and maintain NATO unity, despite the threats that have been made to it since the first Trump administration, in one way or another. But I think the real point here is that it's when it finally comes to a European country, suddenly now we have to call out the fact that the rules-based international order is not working. And even though we've been complicit in a genocide in Palestine for 2 years and said and done nothing, although you could say Carney was among the first, along with Macron, and I think it was Keir Starmer, to put out some kind of a statement about starvation and the need for aid to come into Gaza, around April, May, when there started to be a crescendo of concern, where some of these kind of liberal powers wanted to make some kind of, it started to become clear to them that they might be chargeable for war crimes themselves because of their government policies of continuing to sell arms and weapons to Israel while it conducted a genocide in Gaza. The fact that they put no meaningful political pressure, no sanctions, they didn't embargo the arms, they continued to run diplomatic cover, etc. They started to recognize that there may be a way in which, under some of these conventions that they claim to support, they might be chargeable for war crimes. I think it's only under that kind of set of conditions that they started to try and present a front or a face that they cared about the humanitarian situation and the starvation in Gaza. So they made some statements, they did some things, and that actually has led, I would say, to the worst possible outcome, because it never was intended to actually help the Palestinian people. It has put in place the architecture for the peace proposals and the Gaza, board of peace, right, as being some kind of mechanism for resolving and stabilizing and engaging in reconstruction, in Gaza during this period, now that there is supposedly a ceasefire, even though hundreds of Palestinians are being killed, every month, and starvation is, continuing, et cetera, et cetera. So in fact, I actually blame these kind of paragons of the liberal order for preparing the way for a very devastating future for Gaza that undermines an actual united and concerted front of ending the genocide and actually finding justice and freedom for the Palestinians. So what has happened is now that it's turned towards Greenland, he's suddenly crying about, how terrible this situation is, and it's not tolerable, and we have to do something about it. You know what it reminds me of? is it reminds me also of actually, it's just a beautiful, I have to read this for you. It reminds me so much of the analysis of Aimé Césaire. What Carney is unwilling to say is that we have been party to a colonial order and the reassertion of a rude, brutal, naked, you know, violent, genocidal, racist colonial order. We did nothing about it. But now the aggressive forces have gotten a little out of control and are turning their attention on us. And we don't want to be victims of, that same violence. We won't do anything or say anything about the suffering people of Syria, the war that's about to break out on against Iran, or 2+ years of genocide in Palestine, violating absolutely every rule of international law and norm of the international order. But now that it's going to be turned on, a white European state, Denmark, and it will have consequences on the if a precedent is set there, then it means Canada comes in under more direct potential threat. And you all will recall that when Justin Trudeau was prime minister, and Trump achieved his electoral victory even before he actually was inaugurated as president, he made some very alarming and threatening statements about Canada as a 51st state. He nicknamed, and started referring to Prime Minister Trudeau, Justin Trudeau, as Governor Trudeau, right? And it's in fact actually in reaction to that Mark Carney and the pathetic kind of earlier attempt by Pierre Poilievre, who had absolutely no political patience, his attempt to associate himself with Trump in the moment of his victory and saying that Trudeau needs to step down. We need early elections because Trudeau can't work with Trump, whereas I can, and I'm more aligned with Trump's kind of policies, etc. I could work with him. And so I make my case that I should be Prime Minister of Canada. He's so poorly judged the situation because a week or 2 weeks later, Trump makes these remarks about Canada that threatens Canada's national sovereignty. And it elicited this huge Canadian nationalistic response, on the back of which, as well as like economic kind of concerns, Mark Carney came into power, right? So it's quite interesting that now you see Mark Carney making, this bid to, kind of for a domestic audience, but also I think really elucidating that the key difference now is that it's okay to, the hypocrisies and the violations of the previous world order, the liberal order, were perfectly tolerable as long as it was brown and black people who were made to suffer, and their states made to suffer. But as soon as it was turned, towards a white European or North American, in this case, settler, colonial society, then, that has to be protected. And really, this has gone too far, in the same way that Hitler was judged to have gone too far. And so I think what it really reminds me of is Aimé Césaire's actually brilliant passages in Discourse on Colonialism. So if my voice will allow me, and I'm getting a little hoarse, and if you all will indulge me for going way into overtime here, I did want to kind of read, a little bit from Aimé Césaire, some amazing passages. Before I do that, I did want to say also that, of course, the immediate context for, and perhaps what helped embolden Carney to take this kind of step of like actually calling out and confronting the Trump administration and offering some kind of like different approach to the world of multipolarity that will allow the middle powers to be flexible, in making a variety of alliances, is the fact that he concluded 2 important special agreements, a special kind of trade and cooperation kind of agreement with Qatar, but with China. Okay. Absolutely crucial. I mean, I could talk I could talk at length about this kind of shift towards China. It's amazing. I mean, very briefly, I just have to say that like I was at a board of trustees meeting where they had this speaker at Queen's University had this speaker whose purpose was basically to talk about the environment for educational institutions in the political landscape of Canada. This is before. This is like before Carney won the election, but he was starting to surge, and this guy was arguing that it's not going to happen. It's a false thing. The real point is that even if there's this blip because Trump said some things, and there's this kind of like reaction, the long-term kind of Canadian steady state is that we are tied with our ally, the U.S., where we'll be in friendship with them, and even if there's this kind of blip now, you cannot plan for policies and economic orientations and all of that as an Canadian institution without taking into account that fundamentally you're just going to be going along with the United States. And that secondly, because we need to stop doing humanities and social sciences that are not productive, and you can't make the case for their economic benefit to the rest of society. It's just a drag. It's a waste. You're going to have to reorient everything you do around STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. You have to go hard in that. And if you're going to do that, which you must do, his advice was, you got to get China off your campuses. What did he mean? He said, I'm not being racist, but you got to get China off your campuses. When I said, well, what do you mean? Why should we? He said, well, because the federal government, and ever since, if people recall, the Huawei kind of situation where the Huawei executive was detained and held in custody by Canada on behalf of the US to kind of, deal with so-called espionage and, this kind of thing, that Canadian-Chinese relations were in the really low ebb, and Canada was basically being punished for allying itself with U.S., xenophobic, kinds of hostility, Cold War policy. And he was arguing that there is such kind of, at the level of the federal bureaucracy and that political class, distrust and impossibility of working with Chinese counterparts, and deep suspicion with them, and no working relationship, blah, 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 that if you want to get federal funding for grants as a university in science and technology, you have to ensure that there is no way that there's a risk of Chinese, stealing of your, trade and scientific and technological secrets. I had to laugh. And I said, I'm not sure we at Queen's University and in many Canadian universities, maybe University of Toronto, but at many Canadian universities, particularly, Queen's, I'm not sure we're doing the research that Canada wants to steal. They are leaders in technology. There's a kind of Australian, and I've heard that this is an institute that, is part of the Cold War and flaming kind of like panic and hostility and paranoia about China. But it is, in any case, has a strategic technology tracker, that looks at, 62, I think it is, like very important fields of technology, like whether it's green technology, nanotech, AI, laser, satellite systems, GPS, blah, blah, like whatever, like these key technologies are for military and economic kind of power. It tracks who is doing what, who's leading. And, maybe 10, 15 years ago in their studies, the US was leading in like maybe 42 out of the 56 that it was tracking at the time. Now it's got like something like 62 technologies, and China is leading in 58. Okay. 58 of them. So my argument was, instead of getting China, off our campus, we need to be making partnerships with China, with Chinese institutions, Chinese universities. In fact, if you look at the latest rankings of universities producing STEM like results, STEM research, 10 years ago, there were maybe 2 Chinese universities in the top 10. I mean, University of Toronto was in there, Harvard, Stanford, etc. Now only Harvard and the University of Toronto are in the top 10. All the other 8 are Chinese universities. Okay, so it seems to me that it's obvious that Canada should have been making overtures for years, decades, ever since the George Bush era with the global war on terror, when students couldn't get visas to come to the United States. That was an opportunity for Canada to be an alternate, a more welcoming, place for its own, interests, to sponsor more research and get the best talent and students coming and build its economy outside of total colonial dependence on the US orbit. I mean, I've been saying this since I first came to Canada in 2003-4, that you should orient yourself towards trade with the Far East and Europe, and make diplomatic and commercial and educational contexts. Well, I also said this to people and in these forums, when the Trump administration came to power, both times, but especially this time because of the obvious kind of threats on Canadian sovereignty that were being made, that people reacted to in the political class and in the news here in Canada. But it was obvious, why wouldn't you be now diversifying, your relationships geopolitically and economically? And so now Carney is doing that. Everybody laughed at me at this board of trustees meeting for me saying we should be making relationships with China rather than trying to get them, off our campuses. Now, some months later, this is what's starting to happen. Okay, so that's sort of the context that you see, that there is going to be this kind of readjustment and multilateral. But why and how and on what terms? Is this a genuine alternative to the kind of capitalist order? Or is it, like the fight against fascism, just an attempt to preserve and save a certain form of capitalism from a truly aggressive, destabilizing sort of force? And I see that, this is very much, what we're talking about here, is some way of trying to readjust the system in a recuperative sort of way. But I do want to read this from Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism. Now, this is a great work. It was written in 1955 in French. He was a poet, and was one of the real progenitors and ideologues and cultural emblems of this movement called Negritude, which was a kind of black arts kind of identity and art and kind of orientation, and that was a response, of course, to racism, anti-black racism. And it was an attempt to kind of create cultural and political, relations between African diasporic populations of the Caribbean and New World with Africa during an era of anti-colonial mobilization. And so it's a very important and interesting text, and it's called Discourse on Colonialism. And I absolutely love Aimé Césaire. What he says, I'm going to read some passages here. The very opening of it is: a civilization that proves incapable of solving the problems it creates is a decadent civilization. A civilization that chooses to close its eyes to its most crucial problems is a stricken civilization. A civilization that uses its principles for trickery and deceit is a dying civilization. Very interesting and apropos remarks there, that third one especially. Trickery and deceit, if it uses that, it is a dying civilization. The fact is that the so-called European civilization, Western civilization, as it has been shaped by 2 centuries of bourgeois rule, is incapable of solving 2 major problems to which its existence has given rise: the problem of the proletariat and the colonial problem. Absolutely spot on. I mean, this analysis absolutely fundamental. Okay, great. That Europe is unable to justify itself either before the bar of reason or before the bar of conscience, and that increasingly it takes refuge in a hypocrisy which is all the more odious because it is less and less likely to deceive. Europe is indefensible. Apparently, that is what the American strategists are whispering to each other. So, this is the era, of course, of the emergence and rise of the US as a liberal hegemon, leader of the free world, and trying to characterize itself as somehow different from the old European colonial powers in the global, the new global order as part of its attempt to recruit support and military alliances, you know, in the Cold War against the communist threat, right? Okay, so that's the context. That in itself is not serious. What is serious is that Europe is morally, spiritually indefensible. And today, the indictment is brought against it not by the European masses alone, but on a world scale by tens and tens of millions of men who, from the depths of slavery, set themselves up as judges. The colonialists may kill in Indochina, torture in Madagascar, imprison in Black Africa, crack down in the West Indies. Henceforth, the colonized know that they have an advantage over them. They know that their temporary masters are lying. Therefore, that their masters are weak. And since I have been asked to speak about colonization and civilization, let us go straight to the principal lie that is the source of all the others. Colonization and civilization? Question mark. In dealing with this subject, the commonest curse is to be the dupe in good faith of a collective hypocrisy that cleverly misrepresents problems, the better to legitimize the hateful solutions provided for them. In other words, the essential thing here is to see clearly, to think clearly, that is, dangerously, and to answer clearly the innocent first question: what fundamentally is colonization? To agree on what it is not, neither evangelization nor a philanthropic enterprise, nor a desire to push back the frontiers of ignorance, disease, and tyranny, nor a project undertaken for the greater glory of God, nor an attempt to extend the rule of law. To admit once and for all, without flinching at the consequences, that the decisive actors here are the adventurer and the pirate, the wholesale grocer and the ship owner, the gold digger and the merchant, appetite and force, and behind them the baleful projected shadow of a form of civilization which, at a certain point in its history, finds itself obliged, for internal reasons, to extend to a world scale the competition of its antagonistic economies. Okay, and he goes on for further with some wonderful observations, but I wanted to come to another passage very soon after in the next section that relates to exactly the problem we were talking about with Carney's sudden, you know, uh, analysis of the situation and calling out of the failures of the rules-based order, and the dangerous situation we face now with a kind of aggressive, tyrannical, dare we say fascistic. He doesn't say fascistic. In fact, it's incredibly ridiculous if you look at his speech that the example he uses is, well, how did communism manage to continue for so long? And he quotes Václav Havel and says that the people just kind of went along with it, even though they knew it was, wrong or false. And we've got to stop now doing that, just like they did. I mean, absolutely ridiculous example. Okay, but he says, um, first, we must study how colonization works to decivilize the colonizer, to brutalize him in the true sense of the word, to degrade him, to awaken him to buried instincts, to covetousness, violence, race hatred, and moral relativism. And we must show that each time a head is cut off or an eye put out in Vietnam and in France, they accept the fact each time a little girl is raped, and in France, they accept the fact each time a Madagascan is tortured, and in France, they accept the fact civilization acquires another dead weight. A universal regression takes place. A gangrene sets in. A center of infection begins to spread. And that at the end of all these treaties that have been violated, all these lies that have been propagated, all these punitive expeditions that have been tolerated, all these prisoners who have been tied up and interrogated, all these patriots who have been tortured, at the end of all the racial pride that has been encouraged, all the boastfulness that has been displayed decade, a poison has been distilled into the veins of Europe, and slowly but surely the continent proceeds towards savagery. And you could apply all of this, of course, to a broader understanding of the formation as the West, which includes, of course, the United States, or you could say the United States now as the leader and the hegemon of this kind of system of what he's calling Western civilization, and the consequences of colonialism on it. Now, the main point. And then one fine day, the bourgeoisie is awakened by a terrific boomerang effect. The Gestapos are busy. The prisons fill up. The torturers standing around the racks invent, refine, discuss. People are surprised. They become indignant. They say, "How strange! But never mind, it's Nazism. It will pass." And they wait, and they hope, and they hide the truth from themselves that it is barbarism, the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms. That it is Nazism, yes, but that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices. That they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them, that they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then it had been applied only to non-European peoples. That they have cultivated that Nazism, that they are responsible for it, and that before engulfing the whole edifice of Western Christian civilization in its reddened waters, it oozes, seeps, and trickles from every crack. Yes, it would be worthwhile to study clinically in detail the steps taken by Hitler and Hitlerism, and to reveal to the very distinguished, very humanistic, very Christian bourgeois of the 20th century that without his being aware of it, he has a Hitler inside him, that Hitler inhabits him, that Hitler is his demon, that if he rails against him, he is being inconsistent, and that at bottom, what he cannot forgive Hitler for is not the crime in itself, the crime against man. It is not the humiliation of man as such. It is the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the quote unquote coolies of India, and the quote unquote N-words of Africa. And that is the great thing I hold against pseudo-humanism, that for too long it has diminished the rights of man, that its concept of those rights has been and still is narrow and fragmentary, incomplete and biased, and all things considered, sordidly racist. I've talked a good deal about Hitler because he deserves it. He makes it possible to see things on a large scale and to grasp the fact that capitalist society at its present stage is incapable of establishing a concept of the rights of all men, just as it has proved incapable of establishing a system of individual ethics. And he goes on, whether one likes it or not, at the end of the blind alley that is Europe, and we could say the West or US or Western capitalism or imperial capitalism, I mean the Europe of Adenauer, Schumann, Bidault, these leaders and political figures of post-war Europe, and a few others, there is Hitler. At the end of capitalism, which is eager to outlive its day, there is Hitler. At the end of formal humanism and philosophic renunciation, there is Hitler. Okay, so I just thought it reminded me so much of this kind of moment of what we're witnessing. It's a kind of an analogy to the situation, and it put Amy Césaire's words put in perfect kind of he's a wonderful poet and such a vivid writer, put in such a perfect way and powerful way. Why suddenly Mark Carney and Europeans and people in the West are suddenly, alive to the danger of Trump in a particular way and have said nothing and done nothing. about genocide, colonial genocide, essentially, taking place in other parts of the world, why they're willing to, as Macron said, we're with you in Syria. We can do great things in Iran, but Greenland, hey, what are you doing there? Uh, and Carney then can articulate it in terms of, the end of the liberal order and admitting that, yes, it was hypocrisy, but it was a useful hypocrisy for us and we could tolerate it. But now he's trying to build some kind of consensus and goodwill with other parts of the global south or with China and others, and try and convince that there is some kind of a real difference between groupings within this Western capitalist imperial hegemony. There may be rifts, there may be problems. In the same way that fascism suddenly became dangerous because fascism was turning Europeans into colonial peoples, and that the violence that had been reserved for colonized peoples around the world, the black, the brown, the yellow, the red, that was okay. It was tolerable. But what wasn't tolerable and what was criminal was when it was turned against us. Okay. So that's the hypocrisy that we're dealing with. If Mark Carney has suddenly found a problem, that needs to be addressed in the world situation, where was he 2 years ago? Where has he been in this settler colonial society we call Canada? This seems like a recuperative act. I applaud him for being bold enough to say what is obvious. As Césaire said, Hitler, it was a terrible problem. We had to fight together against it. But what it can't do is resolve both. It is really a form, really in some ways, of neo-colonial reorientation. In just the same way the Americans decided after World War II that if it was going to win and if it was to be the American century, if America was to be the indispensable power of the world, win the Cold War, defeat the communist threat, impose its system, it would have to characterize and portray itself as a democracy, leader of the free world, and as somehow different and escaping the problems of the old colonial order. What it couldn't do, however, was pretend that it didn't have segregation in the South. And the biggest problem and in fact, one of the real kind of reasons you could argue for desegregation and for the civil rights movement was U.S. war in Vietnam in the 60s, and the fact that it was turning and it was revealing itself as a colonial power, and in order to shore up domestically, it had to widen the kind of American project and be a little bit more inclusive in order to kind of save itself in this kind of new form of colonial war and competition. And earlier, and more importantly, the fact that as anti-colonial struggles were taking place, it was very easy for the communist bloc to point out that the US was a racial apartheid society. And it was deeply, deeply embarrassing to the United States trying to promote itself as, paragons of freedom and democracy as a contrast, right? This was really, really difficult for it to maintain. And you would have to say that the Cold War situation had both the consequence of cracking down on dissent within, but also having, like the McCarthyite, kind of, we have to be united in order to fight, this grave enemy. So we can't tolerate, your, attempts at, freedom, etc. This was used to try and domesticate and channel and constrain the fight for racial equality. But ultimately, on some other level, its foreign policy required that it try and not be so incredibly embarrassed in the world order by the fact that there was a Soviet, alternative. And, scenes of kids, black youth, being beaten, having dogs sicked on them, went around the world and completely undermined the US position. And so that you have to think of that there is an interrelationship between foreign policy, international relations, and domestic policy, that they are deeply connected to one another, historically speaking. So, in any case, it reminds of that moment where the US is trying to replace the old colonizing powers, and it has to, kind of distinguish itself. And its problem is that it is a racial apartheid regime. And it really can't, show itself as that different in order to try and maintain the Western hegemonic system. So it just reminds me very much that we're in another moment like that. Okay. So I have gone on long enough. This has been an epic, incredibly long office hours, almost 2.5 hours. You know, um, but there was a lot to talk about, and the one thing that I feel bad about though is that I haven't had a chance to really look at the live comments, and I see Benji has been pointing out absolutely wonderful sorts of things, and great points. Um, and this I don't know if my voice is that good, but it certainly has a limit. So if I was to do any reading of the making an audiobook, I'd have to do it in stages, especially after all of the travel and illness and all that. I still haven't completely recovered, but I managed to get through this, and hopefully you all found it interesting and useful. I will go back and read all of these comments. I love this community and the solidarity and the insight and the discussion. That's what makes it exciting. I have to get better at doing a few things like taking pauses, reading the comments, and highlighting them. And secondly, I have to, stop being a quasi boomer. I'm Gen X, but I have boomerish tendencies in certain respects when it comes to technology, and I have to figure out this system for being able to share links and images and tweets and articles and things up on the screen, so that we can have something that's a little bit more visually engaging than just me sitting here in front of a microphone talking at you, and also to be able to document. I like to have evidence. I'm referred to articles, and I like people to be able to go find them, to be able to share the links, to show that I'm not just concocting opinion, manufactured from vague impressions, but that there are news reports and analyses and scholarly journals, articles. Like, for example, I'd love to be able to post and share more readily the Lancet study that documents and makes the kind of argument that 38 million people have died, from sanctions. And so I got to get better at doing that, and maybe share some maps so that we know where we're talking about. I have a lot to learn. I need my producer, Sina Rahmani, to give me a real crash course on like using this StreamYard platform. Or I have to just spend some time and figure it out, and maybe have an office hours in the future where maybe I don't have to cover everything, but we can play with that. I don't know. It may not be visually very appealing to watch me get things wrong, but I think it's been a lot of fun getting back in the groove with you. Um, I just want to remind you to support Lifeline for Gaza, the Samir Project. I also mentioned in the last struggle session, Rahima Foundation. If you're in the Bay Area in particular, although you can support it from anywhere with a tax deductible donation, the Rahima Foundation is educational and charitable organization that my mother founded 30 odd years ago in our garage. They continue to work on it. It started with helping refugees like Somali refugees and Iraqi refugees and Bosnian refugees that had come to the US. And people who were basically, in some sense, victims of Western imperialism and the global, economic apartheid. They're, economic refugees, as well as people fleeing wars and genocide and U.S. Interventions, the global war on terror. sanctions and sanctions regimes. And, Rahima Foundation started to try and help give support, regular food, help with utility bills and things like that. And it's still going strong. It helps monthly over 1,000 families. So we're talking, between maybe say 5 to 6, 7,000 people every month with food, and quite a number of people with rent and utility bills, with the high costs of food, the high cost of rent, the high cost of utilities, especially in the Bay Area. It's very difficult for people in those kinds of it's difficult for everybody practically, but especially people who are vulnerable. So if you can, make a donation there, that would really be appreciated as well. Rahima.org, RAHIMA.org. Of course, you can always support us, but I'd rather you support those causes. So, until next time, comrades, colleagues, friends, I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. I look forward to speaking with you again next week. Maybe I'll be able to arrange a guest. I got a back channel and see if Benji is available maybe next Friday. I hope you have a great week. All the best. Take care. Until next time, peace and solidarity.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.